There is a version of you that operates with clarity, that makes decisions without the usual hesitation, that follows through not because conditions are perfect, but because follow-through has become the standard rather than the exception. Most men know that version exists. They have caught glimpses of it. In the weeks when everything felt aligned, when effort felt natural, when the gap between intention and action seemed almost non-existent. And then something shifted. The routine loosened. The standard softened. The momentum that had been building quietly reversed. And within days, the familiar pattern of restart was underway again. This is not a failure of character. It is a failure of structure. What separates the man who sustains his best version from the man who only visits it occasionally is rarely talent, circumstance, or opportunity. It is the presence of a precise, repeatable framework, one that keeps behavior aligned with intention even when enthusiasm has faded and the effort no longer feels new. That framework is what this video provides, not as inspiration to feel, but as a methodology to follow. 2 weeks of strict adherence to 3 specific disciplines will do more for the architecture of your daily conduct than months of scattered, intensity-driven effort. The reason comes down to one principle that most men understand intellectually but rarely apply with enough precision to feel its full effect. Consistency, applied with enough concentration, does not just improve behavior. It rewrites the internal record of who you are. Let us examine exactly how that works and what it will ask of you. Part 1. The law of concentrated repetition. Why a short window, lived precisely, outperforms long periods of scattered effort. Most men think about self-improvement in large spans of time. They commit to a year of discipline, 6 months of better habits, a quarter of focused effort. And because the time frame feels expansive, the urgency never crystallizes into daily precision. The large goal sits in the background while ordinary days pass unexamined at the front. This is the structural problem. Ambition scaled to years tends to drift unless anchored by a shorter cycle of concentrated, non-negotiable practice. 2 weeks, 14 consecutive days, provides exactly that anchor. Short enough to sustain heightened attention. Long enough for repetition to produce measurable internal change. The mind does not respond to grand ambition alone. It responds to repeated instruction. Engage the same deliberate behavior each morning for 2 weeks, and the mind begins to organize itself around that behavior. Expect it, then require it. Once required, behavior ceases to feel like discipline and begins to feel like standard. And a raised standard, once internalized, is very difficult to quietly walk back from. This is not motivational theory. It is the observable pattern behind how any skill, habit, or internal standard actually forms. A man who reads deliberately every day for 2 weeks has not just read more than usual. He has altered his daily rhythm. He has made that behavior part of his operating expectation. Rhythm is more durable than enthusiasm. Enthusiasm rises and falls with mood and circumstance. Rhythm persists through both. The deeper mechanism here involves the relationship between behavior and self-trust. When a man tells himself he will do something and then quietly backs away, the internal record of his own reliability declines. It happens gradually, beneath the level of conscious awareness. But the accumulated effect is significant. He begins negotiating with himself on every commitment, because past experience has taught him that his own word is negotiable. Decisions slow. Execution weakens. The gap between intention and action widens. 2 weeks of absolute follow-through reverses this pattern. Each completed day is a piece of evidence. Not dramatic evidence. Quiet. Accumulating evidence that when this man issues a command to himself, he keeps it. That evidence compounds. By the final day of an unbroken cycle, The man is not the same man who began. Not because anything external has changed, because the internal record now reads differently. And the internal record governs conduct far more than most men realize. Consider a craftsman who spent years returning to the same technical problem, not because each session produced a breakthrough, but because the sustained return itself deepened his understanding in ways that no single burst of effort could replicate. The world tends to celebrate the breakthrough. It rarely examines the unspectacular consistency that made the breakthrough possible. The consistency is where the real work occurred. Or consider any person in your own experience who seemed to develop a skill or quality that once appeared beyond them. The change did not happen through one intense effort. It happened through a period, usually a relatively short one, of daily repetition at a level of seriousness they had not previously applied. The seriousness, sustained over days, produced something that scattered effort over months had not. This is what these 14 days are designed to produce. Not a finished transformation. A proven interruption of the pattern of permanent beginning. Most men have started. What they have not done is complete a short cycle with enough consistency that the completion itself alters their relationship to their own word. Approach the next 2 weeks not as a challenge you are testing, but as a contract you are signing with yourself. No audience necessary. No applause expected. 3 specific disciplines applied daily, without revision or relaxation, until the cycle closes. At that point, something will have changed that cannot be taken by circumstance. You will have self-respect earned through demonstrated obedience to your own standard. And self-respect, built this way, becomes the foundation from which every other form of advancement grows. Part 2. The first discipline, the written intention and the mechanics of directed thinking. The first of the 3 disciplines is this. Write one clear statement of what you intend to become and read it aloud, with deliberate attention and genuine weight behind the words, each morning before the day begins and each evening before sleep. The simplicity of this instruction is frequently its undoing. Most men will read it, agree with it intellectually, and then treat it as optional. This is the error that costs the most. A written intention does something that a mental preference cannot. It forces the mind to choose. Vagueness cannot survive the act of writing. When you sit down and write what you intend to become, you are required to make a decision. And decision, genuine decision, not the kind that drifts back into ambiguity by noon, is the precondition for organized effort. Most men move through their days without instruction. They respond to the inbox, the obligation, the demand of the next hour. By evening, they have moved through a full day in reaction mode and have made no deliberate progress toward anything they actually intend to build. This is not laziness. It is the absence of a reference point specific enough to evaluate decisions against. The written intention provides that reference point. It does not need to be elaborate. A single sentence of genuine precision is more useful than a paragraph of aspirational language. Something along these lines. I will become a man known for the reliability of his word and the quality of his work, and I will grow my income by consistently delivering more value than is expected of me. That statement can be measured against. You can ask, at any decision point, does this align with what I have declared? The mind responds to that question when it has something clear to answer against. The morning reading installs direction before the day's reactive demands arrive. The evening reading reinforces that direction as a final deliberate thought before the mind's deeper processing begins during sleep. Over a sustained cycle, this repetition does something observable. Around the 3rd or 4th day, you will notice that small choices are being quietly weighed against your stated intention. The comparison happens below the level of deliberate thought, but its effect surfaces in the choices you make. Clarity is organizing conduct, even before it feels like it is. A useful test for your written statement. After writing it, ask whether you could determine, 1 week from now, whether you move toward it or away from it. If the answer is no, the statement is still too vague. Refine it until it passes that test. Then do not revise it again for the duration of the cycle. The temptation to improve the statement mid-cycle is almost always disguised discomfort rather than genuine improvement. The mind seeks variety as a form of relief from the discipline of repetition. Revision resets the accumulation. 14 consistent days on one precise statement produces depth. 14 days cycling through several evolving statements produces nothing. Commit to the decree and complete the cycle unchanged. A salesman who had plateaued for years wrote a specific income intention and read it each morning before his first call. He did not change his sales method. He changed his reference point. Within a matter of months, his decisions in every conversation were subtly different, more direct, more willing to persist through initial resistance. His colleagues noticed the change before he could fully explain it. The statement had organized his conduct without requiring willpower at every individual moment. By the final day of the cycle, you will notice that the statement reads less like an aspiration and more like a description. That shift, from aspiration to description, is the signal that the first discipline has done its work. Intention has begun crossing into identity. And when intention becomes identity, the effort required to maintain aligned conduct decreases significantly, because the behavior now matches how the man sees himself rather than requiring him to override how he sees himself. This is how a short cycle of precise repetition compresses years of vague effort into a tight window of measurable change. Part 3. The second discipline, the extra measure of service and the elevation of internal standard. The second discipline asks something equally simple and equally underestimated. Each day, render one extra measure of service beyond what is required, beyond what the role demands, beyond what anyone would notice if you had not. One deliberate act of exceeding your own previous standard daily for the full duration of the cycle. The limiting logic most men apply to their daily output is transactional. They match effort to visible compensation. They calibrate exertion to expected recognition. This is understandable as a short-term orientation, but it is structurally limiting as a long-term strategy. The man who gives precisely what is expected will receive precisely what is standard. Standard returns produce a standard trajectory. The man who consistently exceeds what is expected introduces a variable that cannot be easily ignored by anyone observing over time. Not because excess effort is rewarded by some automatic mechanism, but because in most environments where the majority is performing at the acceptable minimum, the person performing visibly above that minimum stands out. And distinction in the right context creates opportunity. This is simple observational cause and effect. The specific form of the extra measure does not need to be large. On the first day, it might mean completing a task more thoroughly than the standard required, or addressing a detail in your work that functioned adequately, but that your elevated attention would not allow you to leave it adequate. On another day, it might mean preparing more carefully than the situation strictly demanded, or assisting someone without waiting to be asked. None of these acts require exceptional resources. They require a slightly higher internal standard, applied with consistency. What happens over the full cycle is precisely this. The internal standard elevates. Not in a single dramatic jump, but steadily, day by day. By the midpoint of the cycle, giving more than is required feels less like additional effort and more like the appropriate level of effort. The floor has risen, and a man operating from a higher floor produces different results. Not because the world has adjusted in his favor, but because he is now a different quality of contributor to every context he enters. There is also a dimension of this discipline that affects self-perception in ways that external achievement rarely matches. The man who habitually gives only what he is paid to give tends to think of himself as a resource belonging to whoever holds the relevant authority. The man who chooses to exceed expectation regardless of immediate compensation begins thinking of himself as the governing agent of his own development. He is using every context, every task, every interaction, every obligation as a training ground for the standard he is building within himself. This shift in orientation is more consequential than any individual result it produces. An anonymous example worth considering: a mid-level administrator in a regional company who had been passed over for advancement multiple times began, without announcement, completing his weekly reporting 2 days ahead of schedule with an additional layer of analysis that no one had requested. Within a quarter, the quality of his work had become a reference point for his department. Within a year, he had been given responsibilities that had previously required a more senior title. His method had not changed. His standard had. Resist throughout the cycle the impulse to perform the extra measure for external recognition. The moment the motive shifts from internal standard building to applause seeking, the character building effect of the discipline weakens. The purpose of this practice is to accumulate internal evidence of a raised standard, evidence that belongs entirely to you, independent of whether anyone else acknowledges it. 14 consecutive days of that evidence changes how you carry yourself. Not loudly, in the quiet, reliable way of a man who knows what he is capable of because he has been demonstrating it daily. By the final day of the cycle, you will not be performing the extra measure. It will simply be the way you work. And a changed standard of work, internalized as normal, is not something that can be casually undone by a difficult week or a discouraging outcome. It is part of who you have become. Part 4. The third discipline: refusing weakness and the construction of self-governance. The third discipline is the most modest in apparent effort and the most significant in long-term consequence. Each day, refuse one weakness. One complaint that forms will be withheld. One distraction that presents itself will be denied. One excuse that begins assembling in your mind will be dissolved before it reaches your lips or governs your conduct. One act of deliberate self-governance, daily, without exception through the full cycle. The instinct is to dismiss this. What could refusing one complaint or one distraction produce against the scale of serious ambition? Without announcement, completing his weekly reporting 2 days ahead of schedule with an additional layer of analysis that no one had requested. Within a quarter, the quality of his work had become a reference point for his department. Within a year, he had been given responsibilities that had previously required a more senior title. His method had not changed. His standard had. Resist throughout the cycle the impulse to perform the extra measure for external recognition. The moment the motive shifts from internal standard building to applause seeking, the character building effect of the discipline weakens. The purpose of this practice is to accumulate internal evidence of a raised standard, evidence that belongs entirely to you, independent of whether anyone else acknowledges it. 14 consecutive days of that evidence changes how you carry yourself. Not loudly, in the quiet, reliable way of a man who knows what he is capable of because he has been demonstrating it daily. By the final day of the cycle, you will not be performing the extra measure. It will simply be the way you work. And a changed standard of work, internalized as normal, is not something that can be casually undone by a difficult week or a discouraging outcome. It is part of who you have become. Part 4. The third discipline: refusing weakness and the construction of self-governance. The third discipline is the most modest in apparent effort and the most significant in long-term consequence. Each day, refuse one weakness. One complaint that forms will be withheld. One distraction that presents itself will be denied. One excuse that begins assembling in your mind will be dissolved before it reaches your lips or governs your conduct. One act of deliberate self-governance, daily, without exception through the full cycle. The instinct is to dismiss this. What could refusing one complaint or one distraction produce against the scale of serious ambition? More than most men credit. The reason lies in how character is actually built. Character is not shaped by confrontations with major tests. It is the accumulated product of thousands of small allowances and small refusals that most men move through without noticing. Every complaint spoken without reflection is a repetition of a particular orientation, one that locates the source of difficulty outside the man himself. Practice that orientation long enough, and it becomes automatic. The habitual complainer does not choose to perceive his circumstances as the governing cause of his position. He has simply practiced that perception until it runs without deliberate engagement. But every withheld complaint is also a repetition of the opposite orientation, one that locates the governing cause within the man. Over 14 consecutive days of daily refusal, this orientation strengthens. Not dramatically, quietly, but by the end of the cycle, the same difficulties that previously triggered automatic complaint now trigger a different first response. What can I do here? That shift in initial orientation is worth more than most externally visible improvements, because it unlocks the effort and skill that were already present but previously blocked by misattributed cause. The refusal of distraction works through the same mechanism, applied to attention rather than attribution. The mind in most men's daily experience has been conditioned to seek relief from discomfort through diversion. Difficulty appears, and before the difficulty has been genuinely engaged, the attention moves sideways. This pattern, repeated, weakens the capacity for sustained focus. Sustained focus is among the most practically valuable capabilities a man can develop. Problems solved through deep attention yield qualitatively different results than problems approached in distracted fragments. Each daily denial of distraction is a small extension of the focus capacity. Over the full cycle, the extension becomes measurable. The refusal of excuse operates on the axis of responsibility. Every excuse dissolved before it becomes a spoken justification for inaction is a moment in which the man chooses agency over comfort. Agency is the precondition for change. The man who accepts responsibility for his position, even when circumstances genuinely contributed to it, is the only man positioned to alter that position because the cause is in his possession. The man who attributes position to external factors has placed the solution equally beyond reach. There is a practical observation worth noting. As the cycle progresses through its early days, something useful develops. The complaint or distraction or excuse begins to be noticed before it executes. Awareness precedes control. Most men are not aware of their automatic patterns in real time. They speak before reflecting. They divert before deciding. The discipline of daily refusal forces real-time awareness, because refusal requires catching the impulse in the moment rather than noticing it in retrospect. This awareness is where self-governance begins. Once a pattern can be seen in real time, it loses much of its automatic force. The man who observes that he reliably complains about the same category of circumstance at the same points in his week has gained objectivity about himself. Objectivity about oneself is the beginning of genuine and sustained improvement because it replaces habitual self-deception with accurate self-assessment. As the cycle moves through its later phase, the daily refusal will require less deliberate force. Awareness will have sharpened. The response time between impulse and refusal will have shortened. By the final days, what began as a deliberate act of willpower will feel closer to an automatic preference. This is the formation of self-governance as a default operating mode rather than a strained exception. And self-governance, once established at that level, does not stay confined to the specific weakness you practiced refusing. It generalizes. The will, exercised daily in one domain, becomes more available across domains. Decisions that previously required heavy deliberation become cleaner. Impulses that previously hijacked attention become more observable and more redirectable. The man who has consistently governed one dimension of his inner life finds that his capacity for self-direction has grown beyond that dimension. This is the quiet purpose of the third discipline. Not to eliminate a complaint or avoid a distraction. To prove, through daily evidence, that the governing authority over your inner conduct is you. That proof, accumulated over the full cycle, changes the baseline from which you operate. And a changed baseline changes everything downstream. Part 5. The Architecture of Coherence. What emerges when all three disciplines are practiced together? Each of the three disciplines produces meaningful change in isolation. But there is a dimension of this cycle that only becomes available when all three are practiced simultaneously and consistently. Something emerges at that level of combined application that no single discipline produces on its own. The written intention sets direction. It provides the reference point against which all daily decisions can be measured. It answers, each morning before the reactive demands of the day arrive. Where am I going and who am I becoming? The extra measure of service creates deliberate forward motion aligned with that direction. It is not sufficient to know where you are going. You must be moving there, and moving at a level that creates visible separation between your current output and your previous standard. Direction without motion is philosophy. Motion aligned with direction is progress. The daily refusal of weakness protects that motion from erosion. Small daily indulgences, unexamined complaints, casual distractions, reflexive excuses, act as a slow leak in any forward-moving effort. They do not produce catastrophe. They produce drift. The third discipline seals the leak. It maintains the integrity of the daily effort so that what is built each day is not quietly dismantled by unconsidered habits on the same day. When all three operate together, a quality emerges that is difficult to name precisely, but immediately recognizable to the man experiencing it. Internal coherence. The sense that what he says, what he does, and what he believes about himself are moving in the same direction. For most men, these three things operate in low-level contradiction. The stated intention does not match the daily conduct. The daily conduct does not match the self-perception. The self-perception does not match the aspiration. This contradiction, running beneath conscious awareness, produces a persistent low-level friction, a sense of effort being wasted, of movement that never quite translates into arrival. When the three disciplines are honored together, that friction diminishes. The contradiction begins to resolve. Decisions become faster and cleaner not because they require less care, but because the competing internal voices have reduced. Direction is clear. Standard is elevated. Internal erosion is being managed. The right choice in most situations becomes evident rather than contested. By the later portion of the cycle, this quality will be present as a kind of quiet steadiness. Not excitement. Not the artificial elevation of a good day. A dependable, calm, internal alignment that persists through ordinary days and through difficult ones equally. This steadiness is a different quality of experience than most men associate with motivation or discipline, because it does not depend on feeling motivated. It depends on maintained behavior. and maintained behavior at this level has become, by this point in the cycle, something close to automatic. By the final day of the cycle, the man who has honored all three non-negotiable practices every day without softening will be in possession of something that cannot be given or taken. A 14-day record of being, by the precise measure of his own commitment, the man he said he would be. That record is not sentimental. It is functional. It is the foundation upon which the next commitment is built, not as a wish, but as a confident projection based on demonstrated capability. This is the mechanism by which a short, concentrated cycle of strict discipline produces changes that years of scattered effort do not. Not by doing more in absolute terms. By doing the right things with enough precision and consistency that the evidence accumulates into a new internal standard. And a new internal standard, once established, governs conduct without requiring the man to force it. It simply becomes how he operates. Part 6. The phases of resistance and why moving through them is the real achievement. Understanding the three disciplines is the beginning. Sustaining them through the specific phases of resistance that every serious discipline cycle produces is where the real work occurs. Knowing what resistance looks like at different stages of the cycle allows you to recognize it as a predictable feature of the process rather than a signal that something has gone wrong. In the early days of the cycle, there is typically a period of relative ease. Newness carries its own forward momentum. The mind has not yet encountered the routine enough to find it dull. Effort feels elevated partly because the novelty is elevating it. This is a useful beginning, but it is not yet genuine discipline. Genuine discipline begins when the novelty is gone. The first meaningful resistance arrives somewhere in the early middle of the cycle, typically after the initial energy has faded but before any new rhythm has solidified. At this stage, a quiet voice may suggest that the formality of the practice is unnecessary, that you were already headed in the right direction, that this level of precision is more than the situation requires. This voice is not offering wisdom. It is offering comfort. The old behavioral pattern is seeking to reassert itself by making the new practice feel overcomplicated. The appropriate response is simply to continue. Not to argue with the voice. Not to reason through it. To continue. The second phase of resistance tends to arrive around the cycle's midpoint and takes the form of boredom. The practice has become familiar enough to feel repetitive, but not yet established deeply enough to feel automatic. Boredom communicates that nothing significant is happening. This is inaccurate. The most consequential changes during the cycle occur at a level that boredom cannot perceive. They are structural, quiet, cumulative. Boredom sees surface. Transformation operates in depth. The correct response to boredom in a discipline cycle is to maintain the same quality of execution you brought to the first day, because the consistency of quality across the boring middle is precisely what the cycle is designed to measure. The third phase of resistance arrives in the later portion of the cycle and takes the form of fatigue-based negotiation. By this point, the effort has been sustained for long enough that relaxing it feels reasonable. Not quitting, just a small accommodation, a minor softening, a single exception that will not really matter. This is the most persuasive form of resistance because it arrives dressed as reasonableness. It is also the form that most often succeeds in breaking cycles that were otherwise on track to complete. Resist it directly. A record of sustained discipline in its final phase is exactly the wrong time to introduce the first exception. The exception does not provide rest. It resets the internal record that the entire cycle has been building. The final days of the cycle may bring a different form of challenge, premature relaxation. The completion is visible, and something in the mind begins releasing its grip on the standard before the cycle has actually closed. The response here is the same as at every other phase. Maintain the same quality of execution on the final day that you brought to the first. The cycle is only fully complete at its actual close, and the value of completion comes from having held the standard throughout, not from having held it most of the way through. When the cycle closes with the standard intact, something settles. Not fanfare, not revelation. A quiet, reliable sense that you are a man who does what he says. That sense is not vague self-affirmation. It is evidence-based self-knowledge. You set out to maintain 3 specific disciplines for a defined period. You did it. Without softening the standard when it became uncomfortable, without negotiating exceptions when they presented themselves as reasonable, without relaxing in the final stretch when the finish was in sight. That completion is the prize. Not because 2 weeks resolves everything, but because a completed cycle proves that you can complete cycles. And a man who can complete short cycles with precision can extend those cycles. 2 weeks becomes 6 weeks. 6 weeks becomes 6 months. 6 months becomes the standard by which a year operates. The compound effect of sustained, disciplined repetition guided by a definite direction is not a theory. It is the mechanism that produced every sustained achievement in the record of serious human effort. The next 2 weeks will arrive and pass regardless of what you decide now. The only variable under your control is what you will have built by the time they close. 3 disciplines. A full cycle. Your word kept in full. That is where it begins.